Halloween was always my favorite time of year. I love the costumes, the decorations, and the excitement in the air. This happened about 10 years ago, and that year, I had the perfect outfit. A costume I made myself. It was unique, a mix of a vintage look with modern touches. I had spent weeks working on it, sewing every detail, and I couldn't wait to show it off at the big Halloween event downtown. The place was packed when I got there. Music was blasting, people were dancing, and everyone was dressed up. I felt pretty good about my costume. It was exactly how I pictured it. Almost immediately, people started coming up to me, saying how much they loved it. I smiled and thanked them, feeling proud of my hard work. But then after a while, some people started saying strange things. One guy came up to me grinning and said, "I just saw you a minute ago. It's so cool you're doing a twin thing." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. He pointed behind him, but when I looked, I didn't see anyone. "You know, the other girl wearing the same costume as you." I laughed it off, thinking maybe he was just mistaken. After all, there were so many people there, and it was dark. I didn't think much of it until another person said something similar. This time, it was a woman dressed as a witch. She looked at me and said, "I just saw you at the bar. How did you change spots so fast?" My stomach turned a little. "I haven't been to the bar," I told her. She frowned. "Really? Well, there's someone here who looks exactly like you, down to every little detail." Now, I was getting freaked out. How could someone have the exact same costume as me, especially one I made myself? It wasn't something you could buy at a store. I decided I needed to find this person. I didn't know why, but something about it just didn't feel right. I walked around the party, scanning the crowd for anyone who looked like me. After what felt like forever, I finally spotted her. Or me, I guess. She was standing near the dance floor facing away from me, talking to a group of people. I stopped dead in my tracks. The costume was identical, right down to the handmade details, the little buttons I'd sewn on the jacket, even the tiny rip in the hem that I hadn't had time to fix. It was all exactly the same. I took a deep breath and started walking toward her. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I needed to know who she was. As I got closer, she suddenly turned and looked straight at me. Her face was blank, expressionless. For a split second, I froze. It was like looking into a mirror, but something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything, she turned and slipped into the crowd. I pushed through people trying to catch up to her, but by the time I reached where she had been, she was gone. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. I spent the rest of the night looking for her, but she never showed up again. No one else mentioned seeing her either, which made me wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. By the time I left the party, I was exhausted, confused, and a little shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about how she looked at me. The weirdness didn't stop there. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. It began with little things, objects in my apartment not being where I left them, lights flickering for no reason, and once, I found my front door unlocked when I was sure I had locked it. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination, maybe even leftover nerves from that night. But then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, and when I looked up into the mirror for a split second, I saw her, the doppelganger, standing behind me. She was wearing the costume again, the same creepy blank expression on her face. I whipped around, but no one was there. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I tried to tell myself I was just overtired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. I started catching glimpses of her in crowds, reflections in windows, but every time I turned to look, she'd be gone. It got worse. One evening I was getting ready to go out when I saw her again. She was in the mirror behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt so real. A few nights later it happened again. This time, I was sure I wasn't imagining it. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a creak in the hallway. I slowly sat up, my pulse racing, and there, just outside my bedroom door, she was standing there. She was wearing the exact same costume, standing still, watching me. I bolted out of bed and flipped on the light, but the hallway was empty. My costume was still hanging in the closet where I'd left it. I checked every corner of my apartment, but there was no sign of anyone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, too scared to close my eyes, listening for any sound, any hint that I wasn't alone. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I couldn't keep living like this. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for that person, the doppelganger, to appear again. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't just in my head. After weeks of sleepless nights and paranoia, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up the costume and threw it in the dumpster outside. I figured if I got rid of it, maybe everything would stop. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock on my door. My blood ran cold. I looked through the peephole, and my stomach dropped. Standing there under the dim hallway light was the girl wearing my costume. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen in place, watching as they stood perfectly still, staring back at me through the peephole. After what felt like an eternity, she finally turned and walked away. I waited a few seconds and opened my door to see where she had gone, but I didn't see anyone in the hallway. The next morning, I left my apartment taking only a few of my essential items and went and stayed with my aunt across town. Thankfully, my lease was up the next month, and only then did I go back and clean out my apartment. I've since steered clear of any Halloween events, and it's been ages since I've worn a costume. I've always been the kind of guy who loves Halloween. Every year I try to make my house the spookiest one on the block. I've done the fake spider webs, the skeletons, the fog machines, you name it. But this year, I wanted to take it up a notch. I wanted something really impressive. So, I decided to build a full-on graveyard in my front yard. I'm talking old, weathered headstones, some eerie flickering lights, and even a couple of those animatronic ghosts that scream when someone walks by. It took me a few days to get everything just right. I made the gravestones look cracked and ancient, like they'd been there for years. I even dug shallow graves in front of them to make it look like someone had just been buried. It looked amazing, and my neighbors seemed to love it too. They'd walk by and compliment me on how creepy and realistic it all looked. But the day after I finished setting it up, something weird happened. I was out in the yard, checking to make sure everything was in place, when I noticed something I hadn't put there. It was a new gravestone. This one was different from the others. It looked newer, like it hadn't been part of my display from the beginning. What really freaked me out was that it had my last name carved into it. Miller. I stood there staring at it for what felt like forever. I was sure I hadn't made that one. I mean, why would I? I thought maybe one of my friends was pulling a prank on me, but this was too real. I hadn't told anyone about the decorations yet, so how could they know to do this? I tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd forgotten I made it, or maybe someone was just messing with me. But the next morning, it got even stranger. When I went out to check the yard again, there were fresh dirt mounds like someone had been digging during the night. I hadn't done that. It looked too real, like someone had dug up the graves I'd made. I couldn't stop staring at the gravestone with my name on it. It was starting to really freak me out. I decided to call the police just to be safe. I figured they'd come by, take a look, and tell me it was just a prank. But when they showed up, they didn't find anything unusual. No signs of anyone tampering with the graves, no footprints, nothing. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew something wasn't right. They told me to let them know if anything else happened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. Around midnight I started hearing faint whispering coming from outside, near the graveyard. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like actual voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it definitely didn't sound like the usual nighttime noises. My heart was racing as I crept to the window and peeked out. There was nothing there. The yard looked exactly the same, with the gravestone standing silently in the flickering light. But I could still hear the whispering. It was like it was coming from the graves themselves. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check it out, but as soon as I stepped into the yard, the whispering stopped. The air was completely still. I stood there for a while just looking around, trying to figure out what was happening. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but it felt too real. I went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I barely slept that night. Over the next few days, things got worse. Every night I'd hear the whispering, and every time I looked, there'd be nothing there. The police didn't take me seriously when I called them again. I stopped telling my friends about it too, because no one believed me. They thought I was just getting too caught up in the Halloween spirit, but I knew it wasn't that. Then, one night, just a few days before Halloween, I heard something different. It wasn't just whispering anymore. It was a voice, clear as day, calling my name. Miller. It was like it was coming from right outside my window. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I ran to the window, but the yard was empty, just like always. I grabbed my phone to call the police again, but I stopped myself. What would I even tell them? That a voice in my yard was calling my name? They'd laugh me off the phone. I stayed up all night, pacing around the house, listening to the whispers. When morning finally came, I went outside to check the yard again. That's when I saw it. A new grave, right next to the one with my name on it. This one didn't have a name on it yet, but the dirt was fresh, like it had just been dug. That was it for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I started tearing down the decorations, ripping up the gravestones and filling in the graves. I didn't care about Halloween anymore. I just wanted it all gone. As I was digging up the grave with my name on it, I noticed something strange in the dirt. It was a small black box, buried just below the surface. I opened it, but it was empty. I don't know what it meant, and I don't care. I got rid of everything and haven't put up a single Halloween decoration after that year. Every now and then, I still think I hear those whispers at night, but I refuse to go outside. I try to tell myself it was all just some kind of elaborate prank, but deep down, I know there was something more to it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that some things are better left alone, especially when it comes to Halloween. It was Halloween night, and my wife Hannah and I were sitting on our porch, handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where Halloween is usually full of cute kids dressed as superheroes, princesses, and ghosts. The air was crisp, and the jack-o'-lanterns we carved earlier glowed warmly beside the steps. Things were normal for most of the evening, but then we saw something strange. There was this one kid, probably no older than 7 or 8, walking up and down our street. His pirate costume was really worn out, like something you'd find in a dusty attic. It had holes in it, and his face was hidden behind a creepy old mask. At first, I thought he was just shy or maybe looking for a particular house, but he never came up to us for candy, not even once. He just kept walking by, slowly, over and over. After about the 3rd time, Hannah nudged me. "Do you think he's okay? He looks lost." "I don't know," I said, trying to play it off. Maybe he's just having fun walking around. But deep down, I was starting to feel uneasy. There was something off about the way the kid moved. He didn't seem excited like the other trick-or-treaters. There was no skipping or running. He just trudged along the sidewalk, staring straight ahead. Eventually, the crowd of kids started thinning out as the night grew later, but the boy kept walking past. Hannah got more worried. "I think we should check on him. He looks confused. What if he's lost or can't find his parents?" I nodded, and we decided to follow him just to make sure he was okay. We didn't want to scare him, so we hung back a bit, trying to stay discreet. He turned the corner at the end of the street, and when we followed him around it, the kid was gone. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. We stopped in our tracks and looked around. There were no cars driving by, no sound of footsteps running off. He couldn't have just vanished, right? Hannah called out, "Hey, are you okay?" But there was no response. At this point, my heart started racing. I tried to tell myself that maybe the kid had ducked into one of the houses, but I knew every house on the block. The few left with their lights on hadn't had any trick-or-treaters in a while. It just didn't make sense. We walked up and down the block a couple more times, calling out for him, but there was nothing. No sign of the boy anywhere. The street was quiet, and the only thing we could hear was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Hannah grabbed my arm. "This is really weird," she whispered. "Should we go home?" I nodded, but something still wasn't sitting right with me. As we were walking back, we passed by old Mrs. Wilkins's house. She's lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, so we figured maybe she had seen the boy. We knocked on her door, and after a minute she came out, wrapped in a shawl. "Happy Halloween," she said with a smile, but her smile faded when she saw the look on our faces. "What's the matter?" I explained the whole thing to her, how we'd been watching this kid walk by all night, how he looked lost, and how he vanished when we tried to follow him. Mrs. Wilkins went pale. "What did the boy look like?" she asked, her voice shaky. I described him as best as I could. The old, tattered costume, the slow, aimless walking. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "You two need to come inside." We exchanged glances but followed her in. She led us to her living room and sat down, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Years ago, there was a little boy who lived on this street. He used to trick or treat here every Halloween. One year, he went out by himself, dressed in pirate costume, just like the one you described. His parents let him go, thinking it would be safe since it's such a quiet neighborhood. But that night, he never came home. The police searched everywhere, but they never found him." Hannah gasped, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Mrs. Wilkins continued, "Some people in the neighborhood say they still see him on Halloween night wandering the streets, but when they try to follow him, he disappears, just like you said." For a moment, none of us spoke. I didn't know what to say. It felt impossible, like one of those ghost stories you hear, but this felt real. Too real. "You don't think it's him, do you?" Hannah whispered. Mrs. Wilkins sighed. "I don't know what to think. But if you saw him, maybe it is. Maybe he's still looking for his way home." We left Mrs. Wilkins's house feeling shaken. We walked back to our place in silence, both of us lost in thought. I kept replaying the night in my head, seeing that boy, the way he moved, the way he vanished. I don't know what really happened that night, and maybe I never will. But every Halloween since then, I can't help but look out the window, wondering if I'll see that same boy in the tattered pirate costume, walking down the street, still lost and confused. And to this day, I still get the feeling that somewhere out there, he's still searching, waiting for someone to help him find his way back home. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Subscribe now for weekly scares. Hit that red button and join our journey into the unknown.